Good morning. Welcome to week 5, lecture 1, measuring the gains from trade and effect of taxes. In this lecture, we are going to look at the gains from trade. Now, when two economic agents decide to embark on trade, there are gains to be made. Now, the gains made by the consumer are referred to as the consumer surplus. The gains made by the producer are referred to as producer surplus. Now, the gains made by the overall society, the entire economy, are referred to as the total benefits to the society. So in every economic transactions, there are gains and losses to be made. So if two economic agents decide to embark on trade, we expect each of them to either experience a gain or a loss. Now, the gains from trade or the gains from a particular transaction to the consumer is referred to as the consumer surplus. So in this lecture, we are going to look at the concept of consumer surplus, producer surplus, and how taxes affect those gains. What are the effects of taxes on those gains? Are there going to be some deadweight loss? Or who actually bears the incidence of the tax when a tax is levied by the government? So these are some of the aspects we are going to deal with in today's lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, as I said earlier, whenever there is a transaction between two economic agents, say consumers and producers, we expect each of them to experience some gain, some amount of gain. Now, the gain experienced by the consumer is referred to as the consumer surplus. And the gain experienced by the producer is referred to as the producer surplus. Now, when we add those two surpluses, the producer as well as the consumer surplus, then we obtain the total surplus. In other words, the total benefits to the society as a whole. Now, the consumer surplus is just the extra benefit gained by a consumer in a market who pays less than the amount he or she is willing to pay for the good. Now, let's say, for example, I'm a consumer. I go somewhere, maybe I go to the store to buy a good. And I have like $10. Now, I am willing to pay $10 for the good. But if I go to the store and say the price went down maybe to $8, even though I'm willing to pay $10, but the market price for the good is $8. So what happens here is I'm experiencing a gain. So if I decide to buy the good, so I am going to experience a gain. And that gain is referred to as the consumer surplus. I am willing to pay $10 for the good, but the good actually costs $8. So the difference between those two, the $10 and the $8, is my consumer surplus. So the extra amount that I get from buying that particular good is $2. So it is an increase in my welfare because I'm willing to pay $10 for the good and it actually costs $8. So the difference between those two is the consumer surplus. So because of that lower price relative to what I'm willing to pay, the consumer here experiences a welfare gain. The consumer is better off if he decides to buy the good because he's going to gain an extra $2. So that is the consumer surplus. So even though I'm willing to pay $10, but the actual cost of the good is just $8. So the difference is the gain that I experience, or the gain to me as the consumer if I decide to buy the good. Now the producer surplus is just the extra benefits gained by a producer in the market who receive more than the amount he or she is willing to sell the good. Now, if the producer is willing to sell a product, maybe $100, maybe he's willing to sell a pair of shoe, produces a shoe factory, is willing to sell one pair of shoe for $100. And if consumers are willing to pay like $120 for that pair of shoe, then there is a producer surplus. The producer is now better off through this transaction. So if trade were to take place, the producer is going to be better off because he's going to gain an extra $20 from the sale of a pair of shoe. So even though he is willing to sell the pair of shoe for $100, but consumers are willing to pay about $120. So the market price there is at $120, even though the producer is willing to accept $100. So the difference between those two is the producer surplus. So the producer experiences a welfare gain as a result of this transaction. Now, both the consumer surplus and the producer surplus are essential in assessing the efficiency cost of taxation. So we are going to discuss this one later on in this lecture. We're going to see how taxes are distorted, how taxes create inefficiency in the market, how it leads or results in deadweight loss. So these are all issues that we are going to discuss in this lecture. So let's move forward. Now, if we look at the diagram on the left-hand side, we have the consumer surplus, so which is just the area under the demand curve. And the consumer surplus there is just 10 minus 4 multiplied by 100 minus 0. 100 minus 0 there is just 100, right? Okay, because the origin there is just 0. 100 minus 0 is 0, is 100, sorry. 100 minus 0 is just 100, and then 10 minus 4 is just 6. Now, if we look at this the area of the consumer surplus in the diagram, we know that that is a triangle. So if we want to find that particular area, all we need to do is to say half times base times height. Now remember, the base there is just the base is just from 0 to 100. That is the base of that particular triangle, right? So the difference between 0 and 100 is just 100, and then the difference between 10 and 4 represents the height. That is the height of the triangle. So we multiply 6 by 100, multiply by half, and that gives us what? So simply that gives us half times 6, which is just 3, and then 3 times 100 is just 300. So this is the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus is just 300. Now let's look at the other diagram on the right. Now we see the supply curve is upward sloping, and the producer surplus is the shaded green region. So we notice that the producer here is willing to accept $2 for the concert ticket, but the concert ticket actually costs $6. So consumers are willing to pay $6 for each concert ticket. So apparently, 60 tickets were sold. So if we want to measure the consumer surplus here, the producer surplus here, that is the gain experienced by the producer. So all we need to do again is just to find the area of that triangle. So the area of that triangle is just half times 6 minus 4, which is 6 minus 2, which is 4, and then multiply by the base. And the base there is just the difference between 60 and 0. 60 minus 0 is just 60. So we have half times 4 times 60, which is just 120. So the producer surplus there is just 120 because half times 4 is 2, 2 times 60 is 120, right? So we notice that the price that the producer is willing to accept is $2. Well, why? Can somebody tell me why the supply curve cuts the vertical axis at 2? Simply, the reason is that the producer is not willing to accept any amount for the ticket below $2. So that is the meaning. That's why the curve cuts the vertical axis at 2. Now, if let's say the tickets, now consumers are willing to maybe pay for the ticket. If they are willing to pay $1 for the ticket, is there going to be any sale? No. The producer is not willing to sell because the only price at which he is willing to sell the ticket is $2. That is the only price. So beyond that, he is not willing to sell. So transaction will not occur, trade will not occur between the producer and the consumer, and so the amount of tickets sold will be 0. So if consumers are willing to maybe offer like $1, even $1.90, the producer is not willing to sell the tickets, the concert ticket. So transaction will not take place. In other words, trade will not take place between the producer and the consumer. So the sale of concert ticket will be 0 in that regard. Now, let's look at what are the effects of price changes on the consumer surplus, the gain, consumer gain, as well as the producer gain. What are the effects of price changes? What will happen to the consumer surplus when the price decides to increase, or when the producer decides to increase the price, or when the seller decides to increase the price of the product? If the producer or the seller decides to increase the price of the product, then the consumer surplus will reduce. The consumer surplus will reduce if the producer decides or the seller decides to increase the price of the product. Now look at the diagram on the left. Now, if the market price were P0 Then the consumer surplus there is going to be that triangle P star, P0, and B. That will be the consumer surplus. Because what the consumer is willing to pay for the product is P star. And the market price is P star, right? So in that regard, the quantity that the consumer is going to buy is Q0 if the price is P star, P0, right? So it's willing to pay P star, but the market price is P0, and so is going to buy Q0 amount. Now, if the price increases to P1, so if there is an increase in price, consumer welfare will reduce because it's going to buy less of the good because of the price increase. And so what happens is that the increase in price is going to reduce the consumer surplus. So if we look at the diagram on the left, we notice that the consumer surplus has shrunk from P star P0D to P star P1B. Now, if you look at that diagram, you see that that empty space there, P star P1B, is now the new consumer surplus after the price increase. So because of the loss in consumer welfare here, the output, the quantity of the goods that the consumer buys is going to be Q1. So the quantity there is Q1, a reduction in the quantity because the price has increased. Now, let's take, for example, the price falls. Let's say the price falls. What is going to happen when the price falls? Now, if let's say the original price there, the market price is P0, right? And then Q0 is the consumer buys Q0 amount, right? Now, if the price were to fall, let's say it falls to P2, it goes down, right? If the price falls to P2, let's say it comes down here, right? Let's say the price falls to P2, right? Let's say this is P, and then we have P2 here, right? So the price falls to P2. What happens here when the price falls to P2? Now, when price falls to P2, the consumer is going to buy more goods. So let's say the quantity increases to Q2, right? Q2. So quantity increases to Q2. So in that case, we notice that, let's say this is point F, right? On the demand curve. We notice that if the price were to fall to P2, then the consumer's welfare is going to increase. It is going to increase in the sense that the consumer surplus will increase as a result of the fall in price. Now, notice that originally the consumer surplus were P star, P0, PD before the fall in the price. Now, when the price falls, what happens here is that the consumer surplus is going to increase. The triangle is going to increase now. It's going to become bigger. The triangle will get bigger. So it's going to increase from P star, it's going to increase from P star, P0, PD to P star, P2, F. Now, the new consumer surplus triangle is going to be P star, P2F. So if you notice, that triangle is bigger than the triangle before the price falls. So a price fall here will lead to an increase in consumer welfare. The consumer is going to be better off. He's going to buy more goods because of the fall in price. Now let's look at the changes in the price, the effect of the changes in the price on the producer surplus. Now, if the price increases, now since the producer is always out or the seller is out to maximize profit, it wants to get the maximum amount from the sale of his products. So if, let's say originally the market price were P1, so at P1 the producer sells Q1. So if the price increases to P2, so at P1 the producer surplus is just P1 P star E. That is the producer surplus. And then the quantity sold is Q1. Right. Now, if the price were to increase to P2, what will happen here is the producer is going to, or the seller is going to experience a gain. So he's going to sell more because of the rise in price. So the producer surplus is now going to increase. The triangle will become bigger as a result of the increase in price. So the new producer surplus triangle is going to be P star star, P2, and C. So in that case, the change in price has resulted to a change in the producer surplus by P1, P2, C, and E. So the new producer surplus is now P star star. It's now P star star, P2, and C. So that is the new producer surplus. So the difference between these two is the change in the producer surplus, which is P1, P2, C, E. Now, let's take, for example, there is a fall in price. If the price falls below the market price. Now, the market price here is P1. If the price falls below the market price, let's say it falls down to P3 here. P3 here, right? So what will happen here? Now, the producer is going to sell less amount of the goods. And so the quantity will drop, let's say, to Q3, right? Q3. Now, this is Q2. Okay? Q2. There you go. Now, what will happen here is the producer surplus is going to change because of the falling price. Now, the producer or the seller is now worse off than before because it's getting less. It's experiencing a lower price for its product. So it's getting less for its product. So because it's getting less for its product, the producer is now worse off. The seller or the producer is now worse off. So the new producer surplus is now, say, if P star, P3, and let's say this point is D, right? So it is now P star star, P3, and then D. Now notice that this triangle is smaller than the original triangle before the price fall. So a fall in the price will make sellers worse off and then consumers better off. An increase in price will make consumers worse off and then producers or sellers better off. The producers or the sellers are better off because of the rise in producer surplus. The consumers are worse off because of the fall in consumer surplus. So the rise in price will lead to a loss in welfare by the consumer and a gain in welfare by the producer. So there is a welfare gain when there is an increase in price for the consumer, and there is, when there is a welfare gain when the price increases for the producer, and there is a welfare loss when the price increases. When the price increases, there is a welfare loss for the consumer and then a welfare gain for the producer. When the price falls, then there is a welfare gain for the consumer and then welfare loss for the producer. So the producer will lose when the price falls, and then the consumer will gain when the price falls. When the price increases, the producer will gain, and then the other economic agents, the consumer, will lose. So this is what happens when you experience changes in prices for the commodity. So let's move on. Now, how do we calculate the consumer surplus? It is easy and straightforward. All you need to do is, you know the triangle, you know the area for triangle. You can use that one and then find the consumer and producer surplus. Now, remember, the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus is the total surplus. We've done this one before, so this is just like a recap of what we did before. Now, let's move on now to the effect of taxation. Now, why do governments decide to tax people? Why do they tax people? Simply, government taxes, or maybe the state taxes individuals, or maybe corporate organization or businesses. One, to generate revenue for the government. Now, the government wants to embark on so many projects, like the building of roads, the state providing security. So this costs a lot of money. So the government need money to run the affairs of the state or the government. So through taxation, the government is able to generate revenue through excise tax, sales tax, corporate taxes. The government is able to use those ones to run the government, to build bridges, to provide social services to individuals, and then also for national defense. So governments use the money. The only way government gets money is through taxation. Now, well, government can also get money through royalties and maybe other fees levied or so. And so that's how government decides to generate some amount of revenue. Now, the second reason why government decides to levy taxes is to correct for externalities and other market failures using the sin tax or Pigovian taxes. Now, when we deal with, maybe next week, when we deal with externalities, you're going to see, we're going to deal with this issue of Pigovian taxes. Now, these are taxes that are levied on farms or producers that try to pollute the environment. So they create externalities by polluting the environment. They do not factor in the cost of their activities into their cost decision. So some individuals in the economy are made worse off because of their production method, because of their actions. They're polluting the environment. So government is going to step in to levy a Pigovian tax. In other words, it's called the sin tax on these producers to cut down on the amount of pollution that they produce. So the pollution that they produce as a result of their production process is an externality. Some people experience respiratory infections because of a polluted environment. So we're going to talk about this one next week when we deal with externalities. So that is one area to correct for externalities. And then the other reason why government decides to levy a tax is to protect domestic industries from unhealthy foreign competition. Now, you look at some protectionist policies that the Trump administration is embarking on, levy tariffs on all imported steel into America, the levy tariffs. But again, it's going to be like a tit for tat. What if some of these other countries decide to retaliate, to impose or levy taxes, tariffs on American produced goods? So there's going to be a trade war. So this is something that we're going to deal with maybe in trade, issue of trade. I don't know for those of you who are going to do international trade. So we're going to deal with this issue. So, but now government decides to levy tariffs to protect domestic industries. Now, let's say we have an industry in the US producing steel. Now, government will want to protect that particular industry from unhealthy competition by foreign firms. So what the government is going to do is now to levy all steel, all imported steel into America. The levy tariff on all imported steel into America. So that means the cost of imported steel will rise because of the tariff, and so consumers of steel will decide to buy the home-produced steel produced by US. And then they will move away from the consumption of foreign steel to domestically produced steel. So that is how the government tries to protect domestic industries. So by levying tariffs. So this is one reason why taxes are normally levied. And then the fourth one is to redistribute income. Now we hear about income redistribution. Now we talk about taxes normally levied in order to help redistribute income. Now talk about progressive taxes, talk about regressive taxes. Now you have the pay as you earn tax system, and for those people who earn more, they pay more taxes. Those people who earn less, they pay less taxes. So government use taxes here to help redistribute income and the economy. Now let's look at the effect of taxation here. Oh, wow. Yes. Taxes, even though they are good, even though they generate revenue for the government, but they also create some distortions in the economy. They also create some distortions. Now, a tax on consumers causes a decrease in demand, and a tax on producers results in a leftward shift of the supply. Now, the tax creates a wedge between the price paid by the consumer and the marginal cost or the price received by the producers. So it creates a wedge between the price received by the producers, which is PS, and the price paid by the consumers, which is PD. So that wedge that is created is a source of inefficiency, or is a source of distortions. So the distortive effect of taxes will depend on the relative elasticities of demand and supply of the good. Now, if the demand is relatively inelastic, the rate of distortion is very smaller, because consumers are not able to run away from the tax imposition. They are not able to run away from the tax, because if demand is inelastic, an increase in price due to taxation will hardly change the demand, will hardly lead to a reduction in demand. Now, let's take, for example, food. Now, everybody, we all need food. We all need to eat. Now, if government decides to increase taxes on food, because the demand for food is inelastic, if government decides to raise the taxes or levy a tax on food items, so what will happen here is the quantity consumed will not decrease by a big amount, because food is a necessity. Now, people need food to survive. So even if there is a tax on food, people will still buy the same amount of food. So regardless of the tax there, people will not run away from the tax. So the distortive effect of the tax there is very small. The distortions created by the tax is small, because the demand is inelastic. Similarly, if the supply is inelastic, the distortive effect of tax is very small. On the other hand, if demand is elastic, that is, a small change in the price leads to a colossal amount, a colossal change in the quantity demanded, or a big change in the quantity demanded. So if the demand is elastic, then a tax on goods that have elastic demand creates huge distortion, because consumers are able to run away from the tax. Now, take, for example, luxury goods. The demand for luxury goods is elastic. If government decides to levy a tax or increase the tax on luxury goods, now many people will move away from the consumption of those luxuries. And so what will happen here is that the distortions will be higher. The deadweight loss will be higher as a result of the tax. So the tax reduces consumption and hence lowers the standard of living. Notice that the after-tax quantity is smaller than the pre-tax quantity. So that's why we say here the tax lowers the standard of living. Because if there is a tax on a good, the consumer is now going to buy less of the good because of the tax. It's not going to buy more because the price has increased because of the tax. So there is a decline in the standard of living. In other words, the consumer surplus has reduced because of the increase in price due to taxation. So the tax lowers the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. In effect, it reduces the total surplus, the benefit to the society as a whole. Now, the distortions created by the distortion created due to taxation result in what is called the deadweight loss or the efficiency loss or the excess burden of taxation. We are going to deal with this concept later on in the lecture. Taxes also induce inefficient avoidance behavior. A lot of people avoid the consumption of a good when a tax is imposed. So it leads to distortions in the economy, and there is efficiency loss. The efficiency loss occur because of the deadweight loss that is created due to taxation. Now let's look at the effect of a sales tax here. Now remember, a sales tax affects the demand. The demand curve is going to shift downward. Now this is a tax on the consumer. Now who actually pays the sales tax? It is the consumer. It is not the producer or the seller. The seller does not pay or who is by law required to pay the sales tax. It is who? The consumer. By law, the consumer is required to pay the sales tax. Now we are going to look at statutory incidence of taxes and economic incidence of taxes. So it does not matter who actually pays the tax. Whether the producer pays the tax or the seller pays the tax, they all pay. The effect is the same. The effect is not different. Whether the producer pays the tax, like an excise tax on cigarette or liquor, or a sales tax on maybe food items at the store. It does not matter whether the farm pays the excise tax or the seller or the consumer pays the sales tax. Now let's look at the effect of the tax here, the sales tax. Now if a tax is imposed, originally we have the supply and the demand curve intersecting at point A. Now because of the tax, the demand curve is going to shift downwards from D to D1. Originally, before taxes, the quantity consumed is Q0. But after taxes, the demand falls to D1. And a new quantity is sold or bought. So the new quantity demanded is now Q1 because of the tax. So what happens here is that the tax has created a wedge between the supply price and the demand price. That is the price paid by the consumer, which is the demand price, and the price received by the seller, which is supply price. what happened here is that when a tax is imposed, the seller is going to receive a lower amount for the good. So what the seller receives is referred to as PS here. And then what the consumer pays for the good as a result of the tax is PD. Now the difference between PD and the equilibrium price is the change in price. Change in demand price. And the difference between PS and P naught is the change in supply price. Now the sum of those two, the change in supply price and the change in demand price, is the revenue to the government as a result of the tax. So what happened here is, before the tax, the consumer experienced a consumer surplus of P star P naught A before the tax. So after the tax, the price increases to PD, and so consumer surplus decreases to what? P star, PD, and B. So there is a loss in consumer surplus from P star, P naught, A to P star, PD, B. So notice that this whole triangle, P naught, A, B, and then PD, is the loss in consumer surplus, right? That is the loss in consumer surplus as a result of the tax. And then the loss in producer surplus as a result of the tax is P naught, A, C, PS. So this trapezoid, P naught, A, C, and PS, represent the loss in producer surplus. And this trapezoid, PD, P naught, A, and B, represents the loss in consumer surplus. Now, the loss to the society as a whole becomes PD, B, A, C, and then PS. That is the loss to the society as a whole. But what happens here? The government is going to get PD, B, C, and PS as revenue from the taxation, right? Now, even though the society loses PD, PS, B, A, and C, but what the government actually receives from taxing this good is this rectangle, PD, P, C, PS. That is what the government actually receives. PD, B, C, PS. That is the tax revenue that the government receives. So, because of these taxes, because of this sales tax, there are certain transactions that are not taking place as a result of the tax. So, these transactions that are not taking place because of the tax becomes a loss to the society as a whole, and is referred to as a deadweight loss. So notice that because of the tax, the triangle BCA goes to nobody. Nobody gets that. Nobody gets that. The government only gets PD, B, PS, and C as the revenue. And then what happens to A, B, and C? That is a loss to the society. And that is why they refer to it as the deadweight loss. It is gone. So this is the negative impact of a tax. This is the destructive effect of a tax. Because even though it increases the revenue of the government, it also creates a deadweight loss. It also creates a distortion. How large this distortion is depends on the relative elasticities of demand and supply. If demand is less elastic, then the deadweight loss is smaller. The distortive effect of tax is smaller. The more inelastic the demand. And the more elastic the demand, the greater the distortive effect of taxation. The greater the deadweight loss. So the deadweight loss is higher because demand is more elastic. Either demand or supply, they are more elastic. So the more elastic the demand and supply, the greater the deadweight loss, the greater the distortive effect of taxation, and the higher the efficiency loss of taxation. The excess burden will increase because of the high demand, the high supply elasticity or high demand elasticity. That is, the more elastic the supply, the greater the deadweight loss, the greater the excess burden. Now, if demand is more elastic, consumers are able to avoid the consumption of the good because of taxes, and so deadweight loss will increase. Likewise, if supply is more elastic, producers will run away from the tax by producing less amount of the good to avoid the tax. And so the distortive effect is high because supply is more elastic. So if we see here, the wedge that is created between the supply price and the demand price is BC. So BC is the tax. So BC is the tax. And the deadweight loss is just BA. Notice that the difference between PD, the supply price, and the demand price is equals to the tax. And if you notice, that difference is the same as BC. So BC there is the tax. It's the wedge that is created because of the tax. And so what happened to quantity after the tax? Quantity reduces to Q1. And so we have a change in quantity there, which is delta Q. Now, if you notice, the tax incidence on the consumer is this small rectangle here. That is the tax incidence on the consumer. And then the tax incidence on the producer is the producer surplus here. This whole triangle down here. Now, let's look at the total benefit to the society. Now, before the tax here, we notice that Q naught is produced and then P naught is the price. That is the market price. Now, if you look at the diagram, left-hand side, you see that OP star AQ dot is the benefit to the society. This whole trapezoid, 0, P star A, and Q naught is the benefit to the society. as a whole. And then the cost to the society as a whole is OA Q naught. That is the cost to the society. So the consumer surplus is just the A under the demand curve and above the market price. So P star P naught A is the consumer surplus. And then the producer surplus is P naught A 0. That is the producer surplus. Now, is there any tax revenue before taxation? No, because there is no tax. So government gets no revenue here. So the tax revenue is 0 before tax. Is there any deadweight loss? No. Deadweight loss is 0. There is no Abaga triangle. There is no triangle there. No efficiency loss triangle there. So because there is no tax here, there is no distortive effects. No distortions are created, or 0 distortions are created when there is no tax. But as soon as the tax is introduced, then it becomes distortive. It tries to create a distortive effect in the equilibrium mechanism in the market. So what happened here is, because of the tax, the price or the consumer surplus has now reduced to P star PD. And the tax is just the wedge between the supply price, PS, and the demand price. So the distortive effect here has resulted in the deadweight loss of A, B, C. So why do we have a deadweight loss here? It's because the supply and demand are relatively elastic also, right? So it's because of what? The differences in elasticities of demand. Because of the elasticities of demand, that's why we have a deadweight loss here. So the more elastic the demand, the greater the deadweight loss. The less elastic the demand, the lower the deadweight loss. Likewise, the more elastic the supply, the greater the deadweight loss. The less elastic the supply, the lower the deadweight loss. Now we're going to see who actually bears the burden of the tax, whether it is the consumer or the seller. Again, it depends on the relative elasticities of demand and supply. If demand is more elastic than the supply, then the producer is going to bear the greater burden of the tax. So the side of the market that is more elastic is able to avoid the tax than the side of the market that is inelastic. Now, if supply is more elastic, then the producer is able to shift the entire burden of the tax to the consumer because the supply is more elastic than the demand. So if the demand again is more elastic than the supply, then the consumer is able to shift the burden of the tax on the producers because they are able to run away from the good. They are not going to buy the good. That is the only way you're going to avoid the tax. And that is refers to luxury goods. Now, if I'm a producer of luxury goods or luxury items, right? So it means what? My supply is relatively more elastic than the demand, right? Okay, so the supply curve is less elastic there than the demand curve. So because the demand curve is more elastic, so what happens here? Consumers of luxuries are able to avoid the tax by running away from the good. They are not going to buy the good, right? So because they don't buy the good, now who is going to pay this tax? It's only the producer. It produces luxury good, then he's going to pay the tax. So the burden is shifted on the producer. So the producer is going to pay the greater part of the tax because the supply is what? More elastic than the demand. So the burden of the tax will shift towards the side of the market that is what? More inelastic. So if you are not able to run away from the tax, then you are going to pay the tax. You are going to pay it. If the supply is more inelastic, it means the producer is going to pay more of the tax. If the demand is more elastic, then the consumer is going to pay a greater burden. It's going to incur or it's going to pay the greater amount of the tax. So the burden of the tax falls on the consumer if demand is more inelastic. Now take, for example, insulin. If a diabetic patient is consuming insulin, the price of insulin goes up, he will still buy the same number of vials of insulin. So regardless of whether the price increases due to taxation, right, the producer is not going to pay a dime. He's not going to pay anything. So all the burden is shifted to the consumer. So because the supply there is, the demand there is perfectly inelastic, a vertical line that is parallel to the y-axis. So the demand is perfectly inelastic. So what happens there? The consumer is going to pay 100% of the tax. So he's going to bear 100% of the burden of tax. Producer pays nothing. Likewise, if the supply is perfectly inelastic, like let's say land, right? The seller of land is going to bear the tax. He's going to pay the entire land tax. He's going to pay land tax because demand and supply there is perfectly inelastic. Vertical line parallel to the vertical axis. So the more inelastic the demand and supply, the greater the excess burden. And the side of the market that is more inelastic is going to bear a greater part of the burden of the tax than the side of the market that is less elastic. Let's move on. Now, we've dealt with this one, effects of tax on consumers. We know these ones are done. Before tax, zero revenue, and then excess burden is zero. And after tax, we have that one. Now, let's look at excise tax, maybe a tax on liquor, cigarettes. What happens here? If there is a tax on cigarettes, what happens is the supply curve will shift upwards. So the supply curve is what is going to be affected as a result of the excise tax. Now, this is not the sales tax. So the excise tax, they are shift the supply curve to the left, upwards to the left. And now we have a new price, supply price, and a new demand price. Again, this is similar to what we did before. So that one is self-explanatory. Now let's look at the criteria for a good tax system. Now we talk about fairness is one. Talk about horizontal equity and vertical equity. Then a good tax system must be efficient, less tax leakage, consistent with fiscal neutrality, and capable of correcting for externalities. Now, if the tax is not capable of correcting for externalities, is not consistent with fiscal neutrality, then that is not a good tax system. A good tax system must be efficient. There must be less tax leakage, less deadweight loss, right? Less deadweight loss. And then low administration and compliance costs. Now, the cost to administer a tax is very, very high. And the compliance cost, again, is very high. So that is why everything has to be made simple. The tax system has to be transparent. It has to be simple in order to avoid what? To avoid losses. Because there's going to be like compliance costs. If the tax is very difficult, if maybe it's not simple to understand, you have a lot of tax laws. If consumers are able to understand or payers are able to understand, it becomes so difficult for them to comply. So you see a lot of evasion, tax evasion, because of the lack of transparency. Again, because some taxpayers have some problems interpreting all those tax laws, rules. Again, a good tax system is one with stable tax revenue, stability in tax revenue. And that again depends on the distortive effect of the taxes or the tax system. More distortions created, the lower the stability, and then the less distortions, greater the stability in tax revenue. Now, let's look at the principle of fairness. Now, basically, we have two principles here. You have the ability to pay principle, and then you have the benefit principle. Now, the ability to pay principle here. Now, individuals with greater ability to pay the tax should pay more. That is the ability to pay principle. So, if it says that if I have the ability to pay, if I'm wealthy, I have high income, so I should pay more than the people who are low income earners. They should pay less. That is the ability to pay principle. Now, the benefit principle. Now, it's individual who derive benefit from the consumption of a good or service should bear the burden of the tax. Now, take for example, federal gasoline tax. Now, if I am driving the road, I have a car driving the road, I should be paying this federal gasoline because I'm enjoying, the road. I'm driving my car on a very good road. So, because I'm using the good, I derive benefits from the consumption of the good, then I have to pay the tax. That is the benefit principle. Now, we move on to progressive and regressive taxes here. Now, a progressive tax is just a form of tax that takes a bigger share of the income of wealthy taxpayers and a smaller share of the incomes of poor taxpayers. Now, you have federal and state income tax, corporate income taxes, etc. Right? So, most of these taxes are progressive because you have the pay-as-you-earn system. Wealthy taxpayers, wealthy income earners, they pay higher. They have those on a high income brackets, they pay more, and those on a lower income brackets. Federal taxes, state income taxes are designed that way. And the regressive tax there is one that takes a smaller share of higher income individuals. Examples is the sales tax, payroll tax. These are all examples of regressive taxes. Right? Now, that tax takes a smaller share of higher income individuals. Because in this case, everybody is going to pay the same amount of the tax. So, those who earn a lot, the share of the tax, their income is smaller than that of low-income earners. Let's say, for example, I earn $10 a month, then somebody earns like $100 a month, right? Then we have to pay taxes for maybe a commodity that we buy from Walmart, let's say $2, right? So, the $2 tax there, percentage of my income is going to be very high relative to the person who earns like $200. Now, $200 out of $2 out of $200 is just so small, right? Let's to somebody like me, if I earn like $10 a month, then I pay $2. So that's a huge proportion of money. Okay, so sales tax in that regard is regressive. Now let's move on to federal, state, and local taxes. Federal taxes are progressive in nature, but states and local taxes are not progressive, right? So why do we say so? Because state and local governments in the US always avoid progressive tax structure because of our tax competition, right? Now, if now many times you see states maybe changing the rates, tax rates, right? If let's say um, um, the gasoline price, right? Let's say the gasoline price in North Carolina is higher than the Virginia price, right? So because of the taxes here, right? So what happened here is now many North Carolinians are going to Virginia. They just cross the border to Virginia and then buy gas and then come back inside, right? So there is a competition here, a tax competition between Virginia and North Carolina. So North Carolina has like a higher tax system and then than the Virginia tax system, right? Where Virginia taxes are lower than the North Carolina taxes. What happens is many people will tend to there will be an incentive for people to move to uh, the region where taxes are lower. Now, even in different counties, you see taxes do vary. Again, in different counties, you see, like in Chapule, taxes are high. Many people are now trying to move away from Chapule. Maybe Durham, other areas where the property taxes are very low. So again, you see there is competition, a tax competition between different counties as well. So as a matter of fact, you may not have a progressive tax structure here. Now, when you look at maybe county taxes or local government taxes, etc., right? So, that's the tax competition we're talking about here. Now, let's move on to efficiency loss of taxation. Now, efficiency loss or deadweight loss is the welfare loss incurred because of preventing other beneficial transactions from occurring. Now, if there is a tax, some transactions do not take place. Now, if you look at this small triangle RPQ, now nothing is taking place here. There is no transaction here. Do you know why? Because here there is no intersection of demand and supply between now this whole region, this whole triangle. We don't see any interaction of demand and supply here. So transactions are not taking place here. PQR. No transactions are taking place. Now, because no transactions are taking place, there is welfare loss. So that welfare loss is what is referred to as what? A deadweight loss or efficiency loss of taxation. So when a tax is imposed, now let's imagine at first we don't have this blue line, no tax, right? Transactions are 100% between the sellers and the buyers, because the transaction between the buyers and sellers is at what? The interaction of demand and supply at point P, right? That's before the tax. Now, if there is a tax here, what will happen is the supply curve is going to shift, and then it creates like a small triangle here, which represents all transactions that are not taking place. They are not taking place here. You don't see any demand here, no demand, right? Now, we see there is a demand at point R, which is Q2 equals 100, right? There is also a demand at this. There is also a corresponding price at R, and then a corresponding price at. But let's say, for example, we are here. We are here, right? Let's say we are here, right? This small red point. Now, there is no price and quantity relationship. That is why I say no transactions are taking place here. So no beneficial transaction is taking place. And this is as a result of the tax. So the tax is preventing other beneficial transactions from taking place. So the loss that is incurred by the society as a result is referred to as the efficiency loss or the deadweight loss. Now, the efficiency of taxation depends on the size of the excess burden or the deadweight loss. The higher the excess burden, the greater the efficiency loss. The lower the excess burden, the lower the efficiency loss due to taxation. And this occur because of the relative elasticities of demand and supply. It is efficient to tax a good that has a perfectly inelastic demand and a good that has a perfectly inelastic supply, because there is no deadweight loss due to taxation. No deadweight loss. All transactions are taking place. No transaction is left behind when the demand is perfectly inelastic. So, it is because transactions are not taking place in that small triangle. That is why we have efficiency loss. That is why we have a deadweight loss. That is why we have excess burden. So excess burden, deadweight loss, these are all the same. Now, the excess burden here is measured as the area of the Abega triangle, which is PQR. And then mathematically, the excess burden is just half times base times height, which is what? The change in quantity is just the tax multiplied by the ratio of the original price to original quantity. In other words, the demand, equivalent price and quantity, and then multiplied by the elasticities of supply times demand over elasticity of supply minus demand. That's it. That is your delta Q, the change in quantity. Then you have your excess burden, which is equals to this, and then half times T squared times that gives you the excess burden, right? So we're going to do those math. Now let's look at the size of the excess burden and elasticity here. Now the efficiency cost of taxation increases with an increase in elasticity. Remember, the efficiency cost here is the efficiency loss, is the deadweight loss, right? It increases with what? An increase in elasticity of demand, right? So that is to say, you see, when demand is inelastic, you see this curve, right? The D1 curve is inelastic. So the D2 curve is more elastic. You see the right, the triangle, the red shaded region. The red shaded region is bigger than this blue shaded region, this blue triangle. It is bigger than that. This is because demand here at D2 is elastic. So economic agents are able to avoid the tax by running away. So because they are able to run away from the tax, because output is going to fall by a big amount because of the tax, the excess burden, the efficiency cost of taxation here is higher. relative to the efficiency cost of taxation at D1. Now you see D1, at D1, what happens here? Because of the tax results what? In an increasing price to PD, what happens? The quantity hardly change, right? Now look at this other one. Price increases, right? Demand is elastic, right? What happens here? Oh man, the quantity demanded changes by a big amount from Q0 to Q2. You see how distance, the distance there is so big than this small distance, right? This distance is bigger than this small one, right? Because demand here is inelastic. So as a matter of fact here, the efficiency cost of taxation is higher when the demand elasticity is high. So it increases with an increase in elasticity. Let's say, for example, elastic demand is -5. And then you compare that to what? 0.2, right? So the efficiency cost of taxation at minus elastic demand equals to -5 is going to be higher than the one at 0.2. Okay? Simple. It's not hard. Now, excess burden and elasticity. Deadweight loss is the real cost of taxation. Now, why is it the real cost of taxation? Beneficial trades are prevented from happening. They don't happen at all. They don't occur. Excess burden will be smaller if demand is what? Inelastic. Supply is inelastic. Excess burden will be higher or bigger if demand is what? Elastic. Supply is elastic. If demand is perfectly inelastic, supply perfectly inelastic, excess burden is zero. Nothing. Zero. Okay? Now, the deadweight loss and pre-existing distortions. Now, there are distortions in the economy created as a result of positive externalities or negative externalities, right? So, if there are existing distortions, if the market is already distorted, now you come and tax that particular market, goodness me, that particular policy is inefficient. The market is already distorted, and now you levy a tax, it's going to increase the inefficiency rate, right? So if you tax a market that is already distorted, it is inefficient. That is an inefficient policy. Already the market is what? Distorted. Now, when government is trying to maybe formulate their policies, they look also at the distortive effect on the market. You know, if the market is already distorted, there is no reason to actually tax that particular market. So the deadweight loss increases in a distorted market. As you can see here, without the externality, you notice that the deadweight loss is smaller, a smaller triangle RPQ, right? Now, because of the deadweight loss, and because of the externality here, what happens here? What happens here because of the externality? Now, originally the deadweight loss was STQ, right? But when there is this externality, you have this supply curve moving to this region. So you see that the Abbaga triangle or the deadweight loss triangle has increased to what? SBW, right? So you see the market was already distorted because of the externality, right? And now you tax the commodity again. And then what happens here? You tax the market. And what happens? It is distorted more. It increases the distortion. So in that particular case, taxing a distorted market is inefficient. Okay? Now the excess burden quadruples as the tax rate doubles. Now, if the tax rate doubles, we expect the excess burden to increase 4 times. That is twice as much. Okay? If it increases by maybe 3 times, the excess burden is going to increase 6 times. Understand? So that's why they say excess burden quadruples as the tax rate doubles. Now let's look at the computation of tax revenue and excess burden here. So what do we need? We need the supply, demand elasticities, we need the equilibrium quantity and supply, we need the initial price and quantity, and then the tax rate. Now let's look at this simple example. Consider a case where the initial price of a pack of cigarettes is $2 per pack, and the quantity sold and bought is 150 per pack. Assuming an elasticity of demand of minus y, elasticity of supply of this, calculate the tax revenue and the excess burden. Excess tax each pack of cigarettes is 0.50. That is the excess tax, right? So this is simple. What do? Tax revenue is what? TR, which is T times Q1, right? And what is Q1? Q1 is Q0 plus delta Q, which is a change in quantity. As a result, when the tax is levied, quantity will reduce to Q1. And between Q0 and Q1 is delta Q, right? So delta Q is just T times Q0 over that times that, and that gives us this one. So if we plug in these values, we're going to have a delta Q of minus 35. Then the tax revenue is going to be 57.42, right? The tax revenue obtained from this 50-cent tax is going to be 57.42. And then the excess burden is just half times T times delta Q, which is half times the tax, 0.5, times delta Q, which is 8.7. Notice that it is going to be negative here because of this negative sign. But the reason why I put positive sign here is so we take the absolute value, right? We don't report negative quantities. Okay? Okay, thank you. Now let's look at the effect of ad valorem tax. What's an ad valorem tax? Now, it is just a tax that is proportional to the value of the good, right? They look at the value and then they tax you based on the value of the good. So it is just a percentage tax rate. Now, common examples include the excise tax on cigarettes, certain imported duties, etc. Import duties, etc. Now, what will happen when an ad valorem tax is imposed? It will lead to what? A shift in the curve or supply curve by a certain percentage. In other words, the supply curve or demand curve just pivots, right? It is not a complete shift, like a parallel shift. Now, if you look at the supply curve, it's like a funnel here, right? So you see, it's because the tax is ad valorem, the supply curve is, instead of shifting to the left parallel to the original supply curve, it just pivots. So this is the new supply curve after the ad valorem tax. Then for the demand, this is the new demand curve after the ad valorem tax. At the new price, at the new demand price, we have a supply price. The difference between those two gives us what? The tax, right? So it's just the same as the previous one. Now let's look at the tax incidence. The incidence of a tax refers to the individual that is legally liable to pay the tax. Now we have the statutory incidence, which we refer to as what? The legal incidence of the tax. Who by law is actually going to pay the tax? Take, for example, you have a tax on liquor. Now, I produce liquor, I'm a producer, so I'm going to pay by law, I'm going to pay, right? So, now, but when I pay the tax, am I going to shift the burden to those people who buy the product, who buy liquor? Certainly, yes. Again, when you look at liquor, you notice that the habits is so strong, so the demand there is so inelastic, right? So demand is like people, alcoholic or drunkards, they used to take pints of beer or so, or maybe vodka. So even if there's a tax on that, they will still buy They bought vodka, they will still buy beer, right? So the demand there is inelastic. So in that particular case, the burden of the tax is going to be the both the producer or the seller and the consumer are going to share the burden of the tax. So it's not only the seller who is going to pay the excise tax. Now the consumer, the person who buys the liquor as well, is going to pay the tax. So they're going to share the amount of the tax, even though the liquor seller is by law who is going to pay the excise tax, or the producer who is going to pay the excise tax, but part of that burden is going to be passed on to the consumers. Now, that depends on whether the demand is elastic or inelastic. If the demand is inelastic, then the consumers are going to pay more of the burden of tax, because the producer is able to pass on the tax to the consumers. But if the demand is elastic, then the producer is not able to pass a great amount of the burden, pass that particular burden to the consumers. So what happens here? The producer is going to pay a greater amount of the tax, or he's going to bear the burden. He's going to bear a greater amount of the burden. So who bears the burden of the tax depends on what? The relative elasticity of supply. So the tax incidence on the consumer here is what? Is 1 plus tax incidence on the seller, right? So the tax incidence on the seller, remember here, is the elasticity of demand over the elasticity of supply minus the elasticity of demand, right? And then the tax incidence on the consumer is elasticity of supply over elasticity of supply minus elasticity. So that is the tax incidence. That's how you calculate the tax incidence, okay? So once you are able to do that, then you will know the incidence of. So if you compare these two, then you will know which one is going to pay the burden of the tax, which percentage, who is going to bear the burden of the tax, who is going to pay, who is going to bear more of the burden of the tax. When you are able to calculate this small, do this small math. This is just small math, right? If you're able to do this, then be able to solve those things, okay? Now, let's look at the basic rules of tax incidence. Now, the legal incidence of a tax does not affect the economic incidence, right? So, it does not affect the economic incidence. It's just the same, you know, whether the consumer is liable to pay the tax or the producer is liable to pay the tax, has no effect on the economic incidence. Now, the economic incidence is what? It refers to what? The person, the economic agent that actually bears the tax. That is the economic incidence. Now, the statutory incidence or the legal incidence is what? The person refers to the person who actually pays the tax. By law, the person who is supposed to pay the tax. That is the statutory incidence. So, by law, the person who is supposed to pay the tax has to bear that statutory incidence. But the economic incidence is borne by everybody. If I am a consumer, I buy the good that the liquor seller is producing, then we're going to share the tax. Okay? So, regarding the distribution of the tax burden, it does not matter which side of the market the tax is levied. The relative inelastic side of the market bears the burden of the tax. As I said earlier, the relative inelastic side of the market bears the burden of the tax. So if the supply side is more inelastic, then it's going to bear the burden of the tax. If the demand side is more inelastic, then that part of the market is going to bear the burden of the tax. So when we're talking about the side of the market here, we are referring to the suppliers, and then the demanders or the consumers. Okay. Now let's do some comparative statistics here of tax incidents. Now, as I said earlier, if you look at this diagram, now the diagram on the left, right? Demand there is relatively inelastic. Demand is inelastic. Now, because demand is inelastic, a tax on this particular good will lead to a greater amount of revenue and a smaller deadweight loss. Why? Because consumers are not able to run away from the tax. So even if the tax leads to an increase in price, they will still buy the good. So demand hardly changes because of the tax. So the deadweight loss is lower, right? Now let's look at this other diagram on the left, on the right. You see that this demand curve is flatter. So the flatter the demand curve, the more elastic the demand. The steeper the demand curve, the more inelastic the demand. So in this case, for the steeper curve, the deadweight loss is lower. Did you see the deadweight loss? ABC is smaller relative to EGF. You see the deadweight loss there is so high because consumers can run away from the tax. They can avoid buying the good if they decide to tax the good. So what happens there? Government revenue is so small relative to the case when the good has inelastic demand. So the efficiency cost of taxation here is very high. Now, who bears the incidence of the tax? Depends on what? The relative elasticities. Now, because demand is more elastic here, it means that the producer bears the greater amount of the burden. Because as a consumer, because the demand is more elastic, I can avoid buying the good. And so the person who produces the good, the producer, will have to pay the greater part of the burden. So the incidence fall on the producer. On the left, the incidence falls on the consumer. Even though I'm a producer of cigarettes, then there is an excise tax on cigarettes. Consumers will have to buy the good because of the habits that they have. They want to leave smoking, they want to continue to smoke. Demand is going to decrease by a small amount. So the deadweight loss is very small. The burden of the tax is shifted on the consumer in this regard. Now let's take a look at the case of perfectly inelastic demand. If demand is perfectly inelastic, the demand curve is parallel to the vertical axis. Now let's look at this case. Do we see any triangle here? No, certainly not. Demand is perfectly inelastic. Because demand is perfectly inelastic, there is no deadweight loss here. Consumers pay the full amount of the tax because they have no choice but to buy the good, even if the price increases due to taxation. No deadweight loss here. Why? Because the demand is perfectly inelastic. There is zero distortions here because demand is perfectly inelastic. Now let's look at the diagram on the right. The demand curve is horizontal. That means demand is perfectly inelastic, perfectly elastic. Demand is perfectly elastic. So because demand is perfectly elastic, an increase in tax here will lead to what? an excess burden. In this particular case, the sellers are going to pay the full amount of the tax. Because if there is a tax imposition, sales will drop by a very big amount as a result of the tax. And so what happened here? Now we see the revenue obtained here, right? The revenue as a result of the tax is this small rectangle. This empty rectangle, that is the total revenue. That is the tax revenue. But did government realize a full tax revenue from this tax? No, because there is a deadweight loss. So many people are able to avoid the tax by not buying the good. So it creates what? Excess burden. And the excess burden is this small shaded triangle. Now we see that when demand is perfectly inelastic, the burden of the tax is shifted on the consumer. When demand is perfectly elastic, the burden is shifted on the producer. Okay? Now take note of this one. The true or false questions in the finals. Take note of them because the true or false questions. Okay? Comparative statics, perfectly elastic supply, and then perfectly inelastic supply. Now, if supply is perfectly inelastic, in other words, the supply curve is horizontal, parallel to the horizontal like this. So if there is a tax, the curve will shift to what? S plus tau, right? And price will increase. But you have the tax revenue, which is given at this small rectangle. But there is a deadweight loss. But in this case, because the supply is perfectly elastic, who is going to bear this burden of the tax? Because supply is perfectly elastic, who's going to bear the burden of the tax? It is the consumers. Right? It is the consumers because supply is perfectly elastic, producers are able to avoid the tax, and they shift the entire burden on the consumers. So that's why we have a deadweight loss. Now, if supply is perfectly inelastic, it means the producers or the sellers are not able to shift the tax, the burden of the tax to the consumers. So they are going to pay the full amount of the tax. There is no deadweight loss. So this particular tax is sufficient. So taxing goods that have perfect inelastic supply is sufficient because there is no deadweight loss. Likewise, taxing goods that have perfectly inelastic demand is sufficient because there is no deadweight loss. Now, in summary, a good tax yields more revenue for both the local and federal governments because the level of distortion is very small. The distortive effect is small. So a good tax is a tax that is less distortive, that has less excess burden, or for which the deadweight loss is very small. Taxes on goods that are more inelastic create less distortion in the marketplace, and so they are good taxes. Taxes lowers both consumer surplus and producer surplus in society, resulting in a reduction. Thank you. Now, the next class, we're going to move on to general equilibrium. We're going to move on to the exchange economy and the concept of the Edward box, the Again, we're going to deal with Pareto optimality here and Pareto efficiency. Thank you.